Welcome to the next video about a game which I played in the Bundesliga. This time I will talk about a game which I played during our match against Bremen. Unfortunately, we lost the match, but the game was a very exciting game against an extremely strong opponent in Kirill Shevchenko. Very promising young Ukrainian player who already has a rating above 2650, but probably is even underrated at that rating. The day before, he won a fantastic attacking game against Volokitin, so if you want, check that game out as well. I played with the white pieces, and because he's a very active player, I was actually trying to go for a bit more quiet game, but he surprised me completely in the opening by playing hedgehog setup. So this is the English hedgehog, and I play the line with rook e1. So here the main alternative is to go d4, but I played rook e1 for all my life, so I continue to play rook e1, and black will just go for a setup with a6, b6, d6, and e6, which is the hedgehog structure. And after d4 takes, queen to c7, we reach the starting position of the English hedgehog. I had a lot of theoretical knowledge on this back in the early 2000s, so I analyzed this position quite extensively with my coach Thomas Jakel around 2002-2003, and I still had some ideas up my sleeve from that time. So one of the ideas is going to be what I will show you today. So after knight bd7, rook c1, castles, we are still in the absolute main line, and I went for the move f4. So at least back in the day, the main move in this position was rook f to e8. Black can only also go for a setup with rook a to c8, and maybe later on something like this. There's also some moves with motives with knight c5 at some point. A lot of different plans for black, but the one he played in the game, h5, is the most aggressive one. After the move which was played mostly in this position, the move h3, my opponent would probably have gone for some line after rook fe8, and then after some transposition after later g4, the motive is that my king is slightly weaker with the inclusion of h5 and h3. So it's a very subtle point, but actually if you play h3 here, I think black can equalize quite comfortably. So for that reason, I went with the move bishop to h3. This is a novelty which I had prepared in the early 2000s, and which is maybe the best novelty I had up my sleeve at that time. Unfortunately, it had been played in between, so I was not expecting that I get another chance to play this. But yeah, my opponent seemingly didn't know this move, which was only played 3 times in a position that has occurred several times already. And where most people have gone for h3. What is the point of bishop h3? Well, it's really caveman style. You just take on e6 in the next move pretty much no matter what black does. You can analyze this position pretty deeply with some other moves. So I think back in the day, the move which I had anticipated from a human perspective was knight g4 to immediately give up a pawn. But then it's clear after, for instance, knight g4 takes, queen takes g4, that white is just clearly better. There are some other moves, like some rook moves, which require nerves of steel, because afterwards you get this the sacrifice on e6, followed by a knight d5 and bishop d4. But the computer actually makes this kind of playable for black. In any case, my opponent didn't know these subtleties and went for the move knight to c5, which I think is the most natural move in the position, protecting e6 for the time being. Yeah, but here I still remembered my analysis, which was to go b4, sacrifice the central pawn on e4, and now to go for this hyper-aggressive knight takes e6. The point is, if he takes, I can just take back with the bishop, and after something like king to h8, I will go knight d4 and knight d5 and bishop d4 in some order, and he can never move that bishop away. So yeah, let's say he maybe takes or something. I just take back, goes away, and after bishop d4, now I'm already threatening to take here and to take here, and white has a crushing advantage. So for that reason, after knight e6, he took on c4, which I think is the most reasonable move. With the point being that, of course, if I take now the rook, I can just take on c3. So at this point, I was on my own. I had not analyzed it, or at least I didn't recall the analysis which I had 20 years back. So I started calculating for quite a while in this position. And then I came up with a move, a knight to b1. First things first, I can't really take the knight, because then you can just take back, and this is always this diagonal which kind of kills me, so that's not an option. And the question is mainly, where should I go with this knight? And my main consideration was to go to e2 instead, but then I had the feeling that sometimes this bishop on e3 is loose. So for that reason, I ultimately decided to go knight to b1. And according to the computer, this is already a first substantial mistake. And instead, the computer suggests the move a knight to a4. And it turns out that this knight in some lines is actually more active here, because I can take on b6. So the lines where the difference is the largest is actually after something like queen takes b4, because then I have to take on f8, and now this pawn is always hanging. So here you see a big difference. But I actually thought that even in the line after knight b1, he cannot really take on b4. At least I thought it was pretty risky at the time, because of knight f8, and after something like bishop f8. To me, the position after something like queen d4 or rook c7 looked extremely risky for black. But the computer is very calm, and after queen d4, it just goes for something like a5 and says the position is just slightly worse for black. It's still kind of hard to believe for me that this is the case, but okay, the computer, of course, calculates this way more deeply than I did. At least my opponent seemed to agree with me that queen b4 is very daunting, and instead went for the move knight to c3. So actually, this transposes to the main line after knight to a4, which the computer gives, because now I'm basically forced to take back. So what is the idea of knight to c3? Well, you cut the line of the rook, and if I take with the rook, of course, you just have queen to e4, and again this battery, which will be deadly for me. So for that reason, after knight c3, I have to go for knight takes c3. And at this point, if he goes for something like queen c6, I think I can just go knight d5 and exchange pieces, and in the end takes the exchange, so that's not really working. And for that reason, he's basically forced to go f takes e right now, with this extremely loose queen on c4. Now the main problem is that I can't take the pawn on e6 as of now. And at the same time, it's kind of annoying that he threatens queen to c6. Thus, I decided to go for the move queen to e2. Which, if he goes queen c6 here, I always have bishop e6 followed by knight d5. So that's not really possible. And I was actually expecting him to take on e2, to just deflect the queen, and then to take on e6. So I was calculating some line like takes, check, king to h8, and knight to e2. And I thought I'm comfortably better here. It was not entirely clear to me if I'm winning or not, but at least I'm very clearly better, because all of my pieces are just more active than their counterparts. Yeah, I mean, still, black is kind of still in the game according to the computer after knight to d5. When I have multiple good options, so either just taking something or just even going bishop f2. All of these options keep my advantage, in particular since he cannot oppose on the c file. It's kind of awkward for him to play that. But I guess since he's so much stronger player than me, he wanted to keep things very complicated, and for that reason he didn't take on e2. Instead, he went with a wild move, pawn to d5. The main idea is that if I now take on c4, let's say, and I go for something similar, check, king h8, then I have some problem with the pawn on b4, which will fall in some lines. and it's a little bit messy right now. So for that reason, I didn't take on c4, but instead I played first bishop e6, and now just the move a2 to a3. I think this phase of the game I really played quite well. Just protecting the pawn on b4, and it's a very, very annoying move for him to face, because he now has the option of playing now queen takes e2 and going for an even worse endgame than what he had before. Or to go for a5, which has a lot of downsides because it's very, very slow. In the game, he decided he doesn't want to have an almost losing endgame after queen takes e2, and instead went for this wild move a5. Yeah, maybe here you can pause the video and you can try to find the best move for white. Yeah, actually when I calculated this position after a3, I thought a5 would just be losing due to a very nice move which I played in this position, the move queen to d1. The queen on c4 is now in a very awkward spot, and I'm still having this pressure on the h5 pawn. So whenever the knight leaves the square on f6, he gets checkmated. If he goes a takes b here, then I have knight takes d5. And now the bishop on e7 is falling, unless he goes for something like this. And then after rook c2, because this is the threat now, he can still sacrifice the queen here. But then I'm just up quite a lot of material, and yeah, the game should eventually be decided in my favor. So for that reason, instead of going for a takes b, my opponent played the move queen to c6. I have to say I completely overlooked and underestimated this move, and I thought, okay, after queen c6, yes, he's threatening d4 and queen to e6, but I can just parry both moves at the same time with bishop d4. Next move I take here, and then I'm going to checkmate him. So I thought this was not possible at all. Unfortunately, it turns out that it is actually possible to play like this. And after a takes b, I realized that whenever I take on f6, you always have as rook f6, and then you can just defend against queen h5 check like this. But still, I wasn't really deterred, and I thought I'm just completely winning after knight takes d5. Attacking the queen, attacking the bishop, and pushing the queen off this nasty diagonal. So I thought, yeah, that would be basically a decisive move as well. And it actually turns out that in this position I had an even stronger move than knight to d5, which is the move rook to e5. Good luck finding this one. With the idea that if he takes on these three, I have rook takes h5 with a checkmate, rook h5, knight h7, takes, and queen to h5. Yeah, actually the computer gives some completely crazy lines, rook e5. Black has to defend, for that reason goes queen to e8, and now the computer gives this move. But yeah, it's not very human to calculate this crazy line. Yeah, as I said, instead I went for knight takes d5, attacking the queen, attacking the bishop, and basically now forcing him to play the move bishop to c5. And I had again completely forgotten that he has actually some pressure along this diagonal. So this came to me as a complete shock, because I thought, okay, I can just take on f6, but now he just has rook takes f6, and if I take on f6, then he's going to checkmate me first. So after bishop c5, I had to regroup, but I still thought, okay, bishop c5, it's not a big deal. I can just take a takes b, and I will win the bishop, and it's still game over. Yeah, again, I did not anticipate his next move at all. I thought the only move which he could play in this position is bishop takes d4, and I was calculating this line, queen takes, queen d6, queen b6, takes, and I thought since I control the square on a2, That's what I saw. Since I control the square on a2, he has no rook a2 in this position, and then I'm just 2 healthy pawns up with a rook c7 incoming on top. So I actually thought he will trade down to this objectively lost endgame, but instead he went for an extremely tricky move, showing his class, the move rook a to e8. Definitely not the first move I would have considered here. The computer now again gives some crazy winning lines for white, which I actually started to calculate, but which I couldn't finish. So the computer gives something like rook takes c5, b takes c, and in this position the move b5. With the idea that you now deflect the queen, and if the queen takes, you have a similar line as before, but now after knight to f6, he doesn't have this queen to g2 checkmate. So after b5, he's probably forced to sacrifice his queen. And after, say, takes, knight f6, and gf, the computer gives a winning advantage for white in a line which now starts with f5 and then goes queen g6. But I have to be honest, to calculate this all in advance at the time of playing rook takes c5, I can forgive myself for not finding that. So instead, in this position, I went for the maybe much more human move, which is the move b takes c. So my opponent initially thought that b takes c is not possible even because of rook to e6. But there's actually now a very nice motive, namely after rook takes e6, it might seem as though he can take on d5, threatening here and here. But I have this crazy intermediate move c6. And now it's just completely game over. So he can take and I take back, but now I threaten on f6 and h5 and this pawn on b7 is otherwise just queening. So for that reason, now after rook e6, my opponent realized that he can't take on d5, but instead was forced to take back on e6. And yeah, now I thought I just take on f6. This makes a lot of sense. He takes back, and yeah, I will win all of his pawns. Queen h5 check, king g7. And now, having just 4 minutes left for the next 10 moves or 11 moves, I took the next pawn on b6. And I thought after c takes b, yeah, I'm just winning. I'm 3 pawns up, and there is no way in which I'm not winning there. Unfortunately, it turns out that c takes b is the decisive mistake, which steers the game towards a draw. And instead, I should have gone for the move c6, also quite a hidden move, to be honest, when after bishop takes f5, the main idea is that he can't go queen to d5 or e4 right now because of queen g6. And then I just win all of his material. So instead, after f5, he's now forced to go for a move like a queen to d6. And now, in some order, for instance, either with a check on g4 or g6, the computer finds the winning move, quiet move, rook to c4, eventually threatening rook to h4, and after some more havoc gives a line which decides the day in favor of white. Yeah, to be honest, this c6 had not crossed my mind at all, especially not since I thought cb is just completely winning for me. Because after c takes b, I had just anticipated that he is going to play rook to f7. And yeah, then I thought it should be somehow winning. And again, lines like the one we have seen before, just a move f5 here, might actually be the correct way to do that. Yeah, and the computer also gives this position as completely winning. Unfortunately, after c takes b, my opponent found the correct move, and this is a kind of study-like draw, I would say, with a move rook to c8. And suddenly my king is horribly weak. As the most obvious illustration, if I take on c8, I just get mated. So that's not possible. And I had thought this move is somehow not feasible because I will in some way get this pawn on f6 and then at least take all pieces off somehow and make sure that I end up in an endgame with 4 pawns against the bishop. But even this turns out not to be possible. So let's take a look at the concrete sequence. I went with queen to g5 check. He played king to h7. And now I repeated moves with queen h5 and queen g5. Instead I could have gone for queen h4 check. And after king g7, I could take on f6, trade everything down, and end up in this endgame, which should be fairly easily winning for white. The problem, however, is that after queen to h4, he has this move king to g8. And even if I take here, he can just take back. And this position is actually already very dangerous for white, because my king is just so weak. So for instance, if I take on f6, I will eventually get mated after queen to d1, queen d2. So for that reason, I decided after king h7 I had seen enough, and just repeated moves with queen to h5 check, king g7, queen to g5 check, and so on. And actually even the computer agrees insofar that in this position, computer only gives a very, very small advantage to white. And to get this small advantage gives another line which is absolutely inhuman, namely taking on f6 here, and takes, and now running into this queen d4 check. And after bishop a6 check, now to run to h3 and h4. And but of course this is almost impossible to find. And even there it's not clear at all that I'm better. So for that reason, after queen g5 check, king h7, I went for queen h5 check, and the game was declared a draw because my opponent claimed a draw by a threefold repetition. I actually didn't realize it was a threefold at the time, but after checking the score sheets, I realized it's a threefold, and for that reason, of course, then agreed to a draw without the arbiter intervening. Well, an absolutely insane game. It was, of course, a lot of fun to play this kind of game against such a strong player. Let me say I have had quite a head start from the opening, but he managed to complicate things tremendously and found several moves like this rook ae8 or queen c6, which I didn't think of at all. On the other hand, he also told me later that I surprised him with some moves, like for instance this queen e2 to d1, this very strong move. And so I'm overall quite happy. I think the end was maybe a little bit unlucky, but overall, of course, it was very lucky to get this opening against such a strong opponent. So I think it all kind of cancels out. That's it from me for today, and I'm looking forward to the next Bundesliga rounds.